Good morning. How is everyone? So today, what we're going to do is to look at the ethics. And we're going to start out just by getting familiar with this text. Physically, what's in actually the book and the structure of it, and some really helpful things. I'm going to try to provide like a roadmap so that you can start to digest this book in an easy manner as possible. This is a challenging text. It's challenging because it's fairly technical. It's challenging because it's an ancient philosopher who doesn't write in kind of plain English in terms of the way he makes his claims and statements. And it's also really unusual for us in terms of, more generally, the structure of his writing. If you think about a philosopher today or writing any essay, right? You want to make a claim that you support with facts, evidence, logic, so on and so forth. Right? What you would do, you would say, today I'm going to speak about thus and so, and this is my claim, and now I'm going to go through the various components of it and support them, explain them, and support them. Aristotle, for some reason, doesn't do that. Right? One answer as to why is because most people, historians, philologists who study literally the transmission of this text and its origins down through time, have claimed that these are actually lecture notes taken by students, basically a kind of transcription of what Aristotle said before his students teaching them, right? And of course, if you've ever heard a professor lecture, they digress from this point to that point and don't go in a quite as systematic way as you might expect when someone's writing a kind of polished textbook, right? So that's one reason why he doesn't write in a as direct way as you might like. The other thing is he's talking to students who are his students, who already have a body of knowledge and understanding of his own perspective. So, for example, we're going to have to address things like human nature and the concept of nature that we've already talked about, in which he's relying on knowledge of his students that are in fact in other texts or textbooks, that he references tangentially and kind of expects a base level of knowledge. So in our first couple lectures, our goal is really to establish this base level of knowledge so that when we get to friendship, right, we can really, the discussion of friendship, I wouldn't say it's meaningless, hardly, but there's so many riches to be gleaned from what he's saying, but you can only really appreciate them without getting this kind of foundation, which is what we're going to provide. The last reason why I think he does not speak as directly as he might otherwise is because he's speaking to students, right? What is the best way for a student to learn? Is the best way for a student to learn by just feeding them facts and information and having them kind of, swallow them, spoon-fed, and then regurgitate them? No, the best way to really learn, this is true of any human being, is for the human being to be forced to reach the conclusions that the teacher is trying to get the student to reach, but to reach them on their own by inference. So this text becomes, I don't want to quite call it a mystery novel, but there are certain things he makes a point of avoiding of saying clearly. He purposely speaks in very roundabout circumlocutions, in a kind of peripatetic way, because he wants his student, and he's dealing with some serious students here who he really expects will actively try to draw out the meaning of the text. So don't feel daunted by this language, right? Don't feel daunted by it. So that's the first thing to say. So now let's turn to our PowerPoint, and we'll jump into this. So our goal is simply to introduce the Nicomachean Ethics. This is lecture part 1. Now, what is ethics? We've talked about what politics is. Politics is the business of the polis, the way of life of the polis, all the public matters, the matters that really matter to the collective life of the city. And therefore politics is concerned, and political science is concerned with the happiness of the community. We talked about politics and the book, The Politics, being this kind of Google Earth view in which we're looking down on the community as an entire organism, in which Aristotle says things like the individual is subordinate to the whole of the community, and the whole is one organism, and the individual is really just a part. So he says, but that's from the point of view of politics. That's not his conclusive understanding, for example, of the human individual. In fact, in the ethics, we're going to find a more exalted place for individuality and the individual as such. And you realize that he realizes that the community is more diverse, and individuals in their diversity need to be taken seriously. So if politics is the science of the happiness of the community, ethics deals with the science of human happiness in terms of the individual. In terms of the individual, their life, their education, their decision making. Right? This is really important. And this book, we talked about the distinction between theoretical and practical. Right? What is science for? What is knowledge for? Well, there's two components. There's a theoretical component and there's a practical component to science and knowledge. On the theoretical side, we're simply talking about the appreciation of science and knowledge for its own sake. Aristotle's going to say because we're human beings, we're naturally curious. We naturally desire to understand. We naturally desire to employ our capacity to know and understand things, and that there is simply a pleasure in and of itself for that own purpose. So the theoretical perspective takes knowledge for its own sake, and part of the pleasure is trying to gain or grasp that knowledge. If you look at this text, you realize this is a challenging task. The practical aspect of the ethics is that it is clearly geared toward helping us as individuals conceive of our own life in relationship to our fundamental human concern for happiness, right? And ultimately what we're angling toward is a kind of combination of seeing three things interlinked. Number one, this theme of happiness. Number two, human nature. How do we know what it means to be happy? Well, we're going to have to look at what human nature is. Happiness is a state of existence that is peculiar or particular to human beings, Aristotle's going to say. Dogs feel contentment. They have emotions. There's no doubt about that if you have a pet. But he's going to argue that happiness is a condition of human existence and is not found in animals. They feel pleasure. They feel even emotional contentment and pleasure. But this thing he calls happiness is very specific. Right? So how are we going to know what happiness is in connection to human nature? And then the question becomes, if Aristotle's Ethics provides the definitive account in the ancient world of friendship, how does our human nature tie into our notion of happiness that is derivative of our human nature? And where do friends fit in those mix? Those three, happiness, human nature, and friendship. Okay. Ethics, the way you understand it today, there are fancy distinctions between morality and ethics. And if you read a dictionary book definition today, you'll see something like, well, morality is what an individual person thinks, and it's not about rules of conduct, but rather it's the principles of action on which they're based. They're principles of right and wrong. Whereas ethics is a set of technical rules for specific professions and disciplines. So you think of like bioethics, or, you know, the ethics of government, or the ethics of being a police officer, where there's each profession, each discipline has its own specific rules of conduct that are unique to it, and that it doesn't necessarily have to do with morality. Well, that's a very modern distinction. For Aristotle, there is no fundamental distinction between ethics and morality. You might say that what ethics is for Aristotle, at least the science of ethics, it is a reflection on right and wrong and the origins and the goals of it, and to determine what the right course of action is in light of the fact that we are a human being. We all know we want the good life. We know we want happiness. But the question obviously becomes, what the heck is happiness? And the full question is, in light of what I am as a human being, a being of a very specific and special kind, what kind of life should I want for myself? Now, the first thing you're going to say is, well, we're all different. We're all individuals. We're diverse. It's a free country. And we all have our own subjective, relativistic point of view on what we want based on our nature and the particular corner of the world that we've grown up in. Aristotle is fully aware that human nature is by definition diverse, plural, malleable to some extent, and that therefore, because people have different opinions as a result of nature and nurture, their uniqueness, that therefore they have different opinions about happiness. And in fact, he's going to entertain a few of those opinions in Book 1, Chapter 5. However, Aristotle makes a bold and audacious claim that we may end up disagreeing with. But he's going to make a claim that happiness, what happiness is something, what we would call objective. It is a fact of our human nature, right? A fact of our human nature. And he's also going to have a conception of happiness that is different from our modern conception. When we think of happiness, we think of some kind of emotional contentment, right? Aristotle would definitely not deny that his conception of happiness would involve some type of feeling of emotional pleasure of one kind or another, or even physical pleasure. But he would definitely not associate that state of mind with what he understands as happiness. Okay, so ethics, it's a domain of moral philosophy which deals with questions of right or wrong, either on the individual or the collective level, right? And ultimately, there's a series of words connected with this word. Ethikos, an adjective meaning having to do with morals or expressing character. Central to this book, the concept of ethos, right? The word ethos literally means custom or habit. It's the way of doing something, right? There's two ways we're going to learn about what the right thing to do is in our life, Aristotle's going to say. Through habituation and through study or learning, or some kind of almost a book learning. Custom and habit have to do with actions that we are compelled to do that habituate us to a certain way of acting, right? That train us physically. Our actions are physically directed. Habit is crucial in the formation of character. What is character? And so this word ethos really has two connected meanings. It means custom or habit. You might talk, and really what he's implying are good habits, moral habits, doing the right thing, being habituated to do the right things. So if you think about a child, they are habituated by their parents to do the right thing through, number one, the expression of a rule on the part of a parent, and then rewards or punishments that are meted out to encourage or compel, as the case may be, the child to do the right thing, right? And you see an interesting challenge there, because we've already seen the village versus the polis. The village, and we might also add our neighbor and mending wall, everything is based on tradition. How one should live, what is the right way to live, is spelled out by the ancestors and passed down one generation to the next. And things like innovation are actually considered contrary to what is right. Even questioning tradition is in a sense violating it, right? And therefore wrong, or even in some cases even evil, right? Interesting, the title of this text, the Nicomachean Ethics, right? Aristotle's father was named Nicomachus, and his son, he named after his father, was also Nicomachus. The title itself suggests the tradition of handing down customs of conduct from one generation to the next. the concept of tradition is invoked in the title of this text. But what's interesting for Aristotle is that the basis of good or right conduct is not going to be tradition. The basis for right conduct is going to be our own rational discrimination about what is right and wrong. And one thing you'll notice about this text is that virtually nowhere in this text will you find a set of commandments. There is no 10 commandments in this book to tell you how to live, right? Rather, there is a description of our situation based on our nature, our desire to be happy, and we are left to reason it out, either both in understanding the text but also in our own life, what the right thing to do is. And Aristotle is really keen to acknowledge that what the right thing to do in some of the most important matters, it turns out to be not simply the result of rule following, but using our own rational discretion to determine what the right thing to do is. Because the problem with moral rules or ethical codes of conduct is that they're general and they can't anticipate the kind of circumstances in which we act. So on one, it said, in situation A, follow the rule. In situation B, only follow half the rule. In situation C, you can't follow the rule at all. And in fact, by not following the rule, you might actually be doing the right thing. Rules can't spell out things like that. Right? So ethos has to do with habituation, or it literally means custom or habit. But it also is the word for character. When someone has ethos, or we talk about like the ethos of the sports team, we're talking about the spirit or character, the kind of righteousness or discipline. When we're talking about character, we're talking about good character. One who has has moral fiber, someone who's righteous, right? Why are these two terms so interconnected? Because how does someone become righteous? Or have good character? They do it through a process of habituation. Okay? So let's just look at the last term here, which is ethike episteme. Fancy word, just means something very simple. It's the science of ethics. That's all that means. And in particular, it's the science or knowledge of human nature. Of human action. Human action. The science of morality and moral action, a science which applies rational reflection to the moral decisions we make in life. This word here is really important, action. Human beings don't just live, they don't just move, they don't just have locomotion like animals. We don't speak, in a major situation, we don't speak of actors on stage moving. We speak about them doing things, about acting in certain ways. Action is a very special word that implies something very specific. Human action, which action itself, something animals do not engage in, is living guided by concepts of right and wrong that guide us in a trajectory toward our goal, which is happiness, right? And action is something that is, by definition, the result of our conscious awareness of the world. It's the result of choices. It's the result of deliberation. It's the result of reflection, or at least the capacity for those things. Because, of course, in any given situation, we don't always sit there and deliberate and rationally reflect. And the fact in life that we're guided by conscious decision-making and reason to varying degrees is actually the precise, it is both the liberation and the problem for human beings. The story of Genesis and Adam and Eve picking the apple really spell this out. The first time Adam and Eve become fully human and choose and live a life of deliberate action, it is actually the very moment in which they violate God's single and fundamental commandment against picking the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, right? Human beings have the ability to choose among alternatives because they can be aware of alternative courses of action. I could have done this, I could have done that. We have options, right? And this actually spells out the problem. Precisely because we do not live a life of instinct, we have to be guided, we have to try to attempt to guide ourselves in a situation in life, in every situation it's true, in which there are alternatives open to our action that are not open to animals, that make it things much more complicated. So by having conscious existence and choice, we're capable of choosing the wrong thing, whereas animals just do what they do, and if they do something that's harmful, it's just built in their DNA. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is to just get an overview of the text. So let's just keep in mind, the first thing is that the text is divided into books and not chapters. So when we speak of books, we're really speaking of things that are like chapters, right? And of course, the books themselves, you notice, are divided into chapters, which are something like typically subsections of chapters, as we would typically understand them. Now, one of the challenges here is that Aristotle does not title anything. The books are not titled, the chapters are not titled. So one thing that helps us get an insight into this text and its entire structure is the outline provided just prior to the first page. Right? So if you look at book 1, which starts on page 1, right here, okay, and you turn back a few pages, you get this outline. Okay, what do we want to understand here? We want to understand happiness in connection to human nature, in connection to friendship, right? Okay, so this outline really reveals the structure of the entire text and the way it's interconnected. And I mentioned earlier the kind of circuitous way in which Aristotle speaks. He raises a topic, and he just seems to move on without making the kind of coup de grace, the final point that really clarifies what he wants to say. So we'll notice some interesting things. Book 1, happiness, the highest human good. What is the highest human good? That's happiness. You might wonder, why does he call it happiness sometimes and the highest human good other times? But you'll have to become aware that when he says the human good or the highest human good, he's speaking of happiness. What's the concern with the entire text? Happiness. We want to be happy, right? With happiness, the buck stops for Aristotle. There is no explanation, for example, of why human beings want to be happy. The question is, what specifically is human happiness, right? So someone says to you, why do you go to work? That looks like such hard work. Why would you want to do that? You say, well, duh, I want some money. And then the person asks you, well, why do you want money? Right? You say, well, I got to pay the landlord. I got to pay the bank. I got to pay the school, and so on and so forth. And he said, why would you want to pay the landlord? Why would you want to pay the bank for your mortgage? You say, well, I want to have a house, and I want to have a family, right? And then you say, well, this kind of strange person says, well, why do you want to have a family? And you go, because I want to be happy, right? And if someone asks, well, for Aristotle, if someone asks, well, why do you want to be happy? They don't get it, right? The buck stops with happiness. There is no explanation of why one would choose happiness. There might be a question of why one would choose a certain understanding of happiness. And of course, the problem is very simple. We all know we want to be happy and that this is the goal. But what happiness is really in doubt, right? And here's another thing, that Aristotle is going to frame our whole understanding of this concern in a way that I think we don't have time to think about on a daily basis. It turns out that our own happiness is not nearly as self-evident as we might think it is. And what he really makes us aware of is the way in which every single facet of our life is really interconnected, and it's all connected to our concern with our own well-being or our own happiness. I think particularly as a young person, it's like you engage in conduct over here, you engage in conduct over here, and then over here, you're doing something naughty over here, you're doing the right thing over here. and you act as if your whole life can simply be compartmentalized and all those things separated, and that those things, just by thinking that it can be the case, that they have no impact on one another. Aristotle lets us realize that every facet of our life is impinging and affecting every other aspect, right? So that's one big insight, I think, that's provided by his broad discussion of happiness. The others is the sense that happiness and human life really requires a serious sense of priorities or prioritization, right? We need to have a hierarchy of order of rank of goods that really matter to us, and then other things that don't matter. And if we really think they matter so much, this is important, if we really think that these things matter so much to us, then we actually have to invest the time and demonstrate that they matter. Because if we claim that X is really important to us, but we're spending most of our time doing Y or not really taking X seriously, it indicates we don't really care that much about X, right? And these are kind of, you might, I call them like Captain Obvious observations, but the funny thing is, in real life, they're the kind of observations we lose sight of all the time. So happiness, let's be clear, every topic in this outline that you're looking at right here dovetails with happiness. It is a component part of happiness, right? So let's just look at it for a second and just look at the associations being made in this outline and the funny order that's being created. He says, what is the highest human good or happiness? So that's the question he raises. Everybody knows that the highest human good is happiness. He doesn't have to raise that as a question. But what is it specifically? Ultimately, in Book 1, Chapter 7, he's going to say happiness is activity or living in accord with reason and virtue. Happiness is living virtuously. Whatever that means. We'll get into that. So you say, now I know what happiness is. Happiness is living virtuously. And then you ask the question, well, what is virtue? And is there more than one virtue? And if so, what are they? And if there is more than one virtue, are there certain virtues that turn out to be more important as a human being than others? Right? So if you look at number 3 here, number 2 and 3, he talks about virtue. Because if you're going to understand happiness, you have to understand virtue in light of the way he's defined it. Then, in books 3 through 5, you see number 3 here, he gives us a list of all the moral virtues. All the moral virtues, right? If happiness is living virtuously, we better know what virtue is. And here, this is unfortunately the part of the text we're not going to spend as much time with. But here he gives us very specific insights into the various types of moral virtues. And what does it actually mean, moral virtues? Obviously, it has to do with right or wrong, but even the other types of virtues do have to deal with right or wrong in certain ways as well. But moral virtues you might even call them social virtues or practical virtues. They're virtues that have to do with how we conduct ourselves with other people, but maybe even also in our relationship with ourselves. Then you see number 4, intellectual virtues and the problem of prudence. So it turns out that there's 2 sets of virtues, moral virtues and intellectual virtues. So if happiness is a virtuous life or living virtuously or activity in accord with virtue and reason, it raises the question of there's 2 types of virtues, moral and intellectual. Are all virtues created equal? Are they the same? Are there virtues that are superior to one another? Then he talks about self-restraint and lack of self-restraint. To be virtuous, to be rational, be by definition to be capable of self-restraint. And of course, as we've seen with Hobbes, to just take one example, human beings have a tough time restraining themselves, except through external constraint. Right? People need walls. They need boundaries. They need external things to constrain their behavior because they don't seem to be able to do it themselves. right? It would seem that true happiness for Aristotle, just by looking at this outline, would involve the necessity of self-restraint. You control and regulate your actions rather than the police, right? Then he moves on to a discussion of pleasure. Pleasure. Happiness and pleasure. Do they go together? Perhaps. Might depend on what kind of pleasure it is, right? And this raises an important element here. Human nature, on the simplest level, we consist of a body and a soul. And we have pleasures of the body, and we have pleasures of the soul. And then the pleasures of the soul can be broken down into rational or intellectual pleasures, and it can be broken down into other types of emotional and social pleasures. So there's a whole variety of pleasures, and obviously I think we would naturally say happiness is some state of pleasure. The question is, what pleasures matter as happiness? And this is really important, right? Aristotle's talking about a side point I want to make here. Aristotle's talking about morality here. And he's talking about the right way to live. The right way to live, right? But Aristotle, you have to understand, is a Greek. He is not a Christian. He is not a Puritan. He's writing in the 4th century BC, 370 some years before Jesus even comes into existence. And some other schools of thought that see the right way of life as abstaining from things, not engaging in certain types of pleasures. If you think of Christianity, the whole, at least certain strands of Christianity, the body itself is the site of sin, and sex for anything other than procreation is considered sinful, and the pleasures of the body are not celebrated in any way. And the word pleasure and kind of Christian morality don't go so perfectly together. There's a kind of righteous pleasure, perhaps, that comes from being a righteous human being. But the Greeks are slightly different. The Greeks have a very this-worldly morality. The fruits of morality come in your relationship with yourself and your relationship with your community, right? The Greeks are a people who are living in this world. It will be interesting because Aristotle will subordinate the pleasures of the body and the desires of the body as a kind of inferior form of pleasure or happiness, but he's not going to denigrate them. He's not going to say they're bad for you. He's just going to say they're not the most important pleasure. Most important pleasures to be had. Well, what pleasures are the most important? So look at this, 6, 7, and 8. A discussion of pleasure, a discussion of friendship, and a discussion of pleasure again. Friendship is sandwiched in between pleasure. Just by looking at this, I think it's pretty clear Aristotle associates our discourse, our intercourse, our interaction, our connectedness, our intimacy with other human beings as not just pleasure, but perhaps one of the central pleasures that human beings experience simply by the arrangement of this text, which is, I'd say, hardly accidental. And you see how carefully it's laid out when you look at the logical unfolding of these concepts in this outline. This is going to be really important because in the politics, the concern for other people starts out of bodily needs, survival and the needs of the body, and then just those needs writ large in the polis. Ironically, much of the polis's political concerns are going to be with things that help to sustain the community at large, and the concept of happiness in the polis is simply one where people are acting in a law-abiding way, and they have provided for them sufficiently the needs of the body. But to say that they're law-abiding, to say that they have subordinated their desires to matters of justice is simply what's the function of justice? It's the rules that are in the interest of the well-being of the community, and you might say the proper functioning of the community. But we would hardly say that simply following the rules of your community writ large is, a notion of happiness or a terribly exalted thing to do. I mean, first of all, following the law for the most part is really pretty easy, right? Aristotle is going to give a conception, this is important, of human interaction that goes way beyond just needs. And you might say it's the intimacy between human beings that's part of our natural emotional desires and also our intellectual desires. So then, this is really interesting. Number 9, happiness and contemplation. Now wait a second. Didn't he discuss happiness in book 1? Well, once you've read book 1, you're going to realize that he did not complete his discussion of happiness in book 1. In fact, he leaves you with a big cliffhanger. And guess what? I am going to leave you with that same cliffhanger. And I ask you now, when he says happiness is rational activity in accord with virtue, you're like, what? What is he talking about? Well, the answer is you don't really find out what activity he sees as fulfilling human happiness until book 10. So the answer, you will not get the answer without reading both books, but the full answer, the complete answer, is not found until book 10. And then number 10 on this outline, you see transition to the politics. So it's historically been understood that the ethics precedes the politics. It starts with the individual point of view and moves to the collective point of view. I suppose because the individual point of view is the one we can first grasp, right? Like our own point of view. And if politics is a Google Earth point of view, the ethics is like a Google Street View, where we are now walking as an individual down a street and seeing the panorama of moral life around us and engaging with others on a more individual level than this collective view in the politics. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is to turn to the opening lines of the text, and in a moment, so page 1, book 1, and I want to talk about goods. Funny concept. What's a good? What's a good for Aristotle? What has he called human happiness? He has called it the human good, right? And it raises the question of what he means by the word good. And the word good is going to appear in the concept over and over and over and over again in this text. And it's important we have a clear understanding of its meaning. When we think of the word good, we think of good and bad, we think of morality. That connotation is certainly not removed from his thinking, but it's not initially the primary understanding of this term. If you think of a consumer good, right? A consumer good is a product that you buy because you want it. It fulfills some need or desire, right? And his concept of good is very simple, right? A good is that which you perceive, and perceive is important, that which you perceive as beneficial to yourself and your life. And ultimately, in light of his understanding of happiness, that which you perceive as good for yourself is going to benefit you immediately, but it's also going to benefit you in the totality of your concern for happiness, right? He says happiness is the thing for the sake of which we do all else. Not just some things. He says everything we do, whether we're cognizant of it or not, is directed to our concern for happiness. So if that's the case, we should be aware of it. But what is a good? It's something that appears good. Meaning not necessarily morally good, although it could be morally good, but something that we see as beneficial. We rather like to have it rather than not. We feel like we'd be better off with it than not. So health is a good to the body. Beauty is a good to the body in the social sphere and the private. Intellect is a good for someone in school who needs the capacity to understand things. Food is good for the body because you need it to survive. A good, right? And the important thing is, in many cases, in real life, and this book is about real life, and it's really about our lives, it's relevant to all of us. We go through life thinking or assuming, or we have the opinion that something may be good for us, and it may not be. So there's a distinction between appearance and reality. And of course, many ways we learn that things are bad for us is through trial and error. In some cases, we're habituated. We're told what's right and what's wrong. But of course, those categories aren't absolute. And many things we encounter in the world have not been told to us or spoken about to, say, by our parents or our teachers or the people we learn from. And we have to find out sometimes the hard way, trial and error, whether something is good or not. So the important thing for Aristotle is there are various categories of goods. Categories of goods. There are goods that are ends. There are goods that are means. And there are goods that are both means and ends. Goods that are ends are the end or goal of our action. Happiness is an end, and it turns out to be an end of all our actions. And the word end here is the Greek word telos. It's the goal of everything we're doing. It's what we want, right? Why am I working? Because I want money. So work, the end of work, the goal of work is to get the money. And ironically, then when you look at the money, you realize that it was an end, but it's also a means. So something like money would, in this instance, be both a means and an end, right? So think about it. Why are you working? Because I want money. It appears just to be an end. But then when I get the money, I don't just let it sit there for its own sake. I buy something with it. So what I really wanted the money for was an end of a new toothbrush. And I want to get an electric toothbrush. Okay, but then here's the funny thing. That thing is not an end in itself because I want my teeth to be clean. And why do you want your teeth to be clean? There's a whole other series of ends. And you go up and you go up and you go up until ultimately you're going to get to happiness. A means. A means is something that is a tool or an instrument to achieve your ends. So for Aristotle, there's a very important hierarchy that ends are always superior to means. The means is the tool you use to get to the end. And what do you really want? You're not really concerned with the tool as long as it does its job. What you're really concerned with is what the tool gets you. So for most people, I mean, you like money insofar as it gets you what you want. It gets you those ends. But really, it's just, dirty, bacteria-laden paper, right? Or, an entry on the computer screen. Okay. Let's move this out of the way. And then 3 more sets of goods that are related to those first 3. There are goods of the soul, there are goods of the body, and there are external goods. Human nature is defined by having a body and a soul. We'll talk more about the soul in our discussion of human nature more specifically. The soul is just psychology. It's our mind and our emotions, our mind and our heart, you might say, coupled together. So external, let's just start with the easiest one. External goods, they're very much like consumer goods. That's like wealth and property and physical artifacts that assist you in providing for your needs and desires, right? Your material well-being, what Aristotle is going to call equipment. And the word equipment is really great because it gets at this issue of it's a tool. Equipment is a tool for a larger end or a larger purpose beyond itself, right? Goods of the body, things like health, beauty, strength, agility, and goods of the soul like knowledge, understanding, wisdom, moral virtue, and the like, right? And if there's a hierarchy of goods, there's also a hierarchy of human nature. The soul is superior to the body in the politics. Aristotle says the soul should rule over the body as master rules over a slave. Right? The body is our lower half, and it should be ruled by our upper half. So let's read, just to get a sense of Aristotle's writing and the challenge of it. Book 1, Chapter 1. It says, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action as well as choice, is held to aim at some good. Now notice, this is how Aristotle talks. He gives you no context for this. And then he says of this statement, it is held to aim at some good. He doesn't say, I believe, or I think it is the case that these things aim at some good. He says it's held as an opinion by some people. So he's constantly saying, some people say, and it is said, and wise man has once said, and it is often stated that, and on and on and on. And you realize that there is a clear distinction between his own personal assertion of what he thinks to be true versus what other people say. And we already have this distinction between appearance and reality. And you're going to notice that in a book on morality, that the very facts of the science are very different from the natural sciences. If you want the facts in a natural science, you look under a microscope or you look in an observation during an experiment. But what is a moral science all about? A moral science is about understandings, or the understanding of right and wrong, good and bad, good and evil, beneficial and harmful, and human happiness. Well, where are we going to look to understand about those things? We're going to look in people's opinions. That's where the moral scientist, the ethicist, is going to look to observe, to get data, and then that will be the data on which he will ruminate and try to reach a more refined conclusion about what he wants to assert as happiness. And let's just say this, Aristotle really cloaks his own opinions many times for various reasons, perhaps because they're contrary to the status quo of his own society, and they're rather provocative. And there is a very serious provocative question about the relationship in happiness between moral and intellectual virtue that we're going to see, that raises some very disturbing questions that go largely unanswered by Aristotle. And it's stunning. He must be aware of these questions, because people have been asking them about this text for thousands of years, and he does not give us a simple, clear answer. Every art, every inquiry, and every action, as well as choice, is held to aim at some good. Right? Everything aims at some end or purpose that is good. An end is by definition considered good because you think that's what you want. Right? This raises Aristotle's whole understanding of all the sciences as being teleological, a science of ends or goals or purposes, a belief that everything has a purpose, or in French, a raison d'être, a reason for being, a purpose for being, right? Does the cosmos have a reason for being? Does it have a purpose? Does the earth have a purpose? Does the moon have a purpose? Does the sun have a purpose, right? There's a great little sketch in Bill Cosby where he plays a phys ed instructor, and he asks this ridiculous philosophical question, why is there air? And he, the phys ed instructor, goes, well, that's obvious. It's to blow up volleyballs, right? And you can see the problem with asking, is there a purpose to naturally occurring things? But notice the things he chooses to speak about here. Arts, which are like crafts. He speaks of inquiries. What's an inquiry? It's an investigation. What is the ethics? It is an investigation into human happiness and the conditions that might provide for our own well-being. Inquiries have goals. What is the goal of this book? To understand happiness. Every action has a goal or a purpose or an end. We take a course of action hoping that we get a certain outcome that we thought at the beginning might obtain from performing that action. And sometimes we're right and sometimes we're wrong. A choice. A choice, we choose between two or more things based on what we think is good. He says, hence people have nobly declared that the good is that at which all things aim. Now notice, he says, hence people. Who are those people? Have nobly declared that the good is that at which all things aim. Right? Noble. To be noble is to be dignified and honorable, but also beautiful. Kalos is the Greek word. He doesn't say true, he says noble. There's an interesting question as whether good, everything in the universe or the cosmos tends toward the good. But certainly if we look from the level of human life, we're all concerned with doing something that it appears good to us. But there appears to be a certain distinct difference among the ends. Some ends are activities and others are works, apart from these activities themselves. And in those cases in which there are certain activities apart from the actions, the works are naturally better than the activities. So he introduces the concept of activities and works. Works are the product of activities. Works are like things you make as a result of, a potter. You perform an activity, and then there's a final product. And when you do the activity, what's your real concern? Your real concern is not the activity itself. Your real concern, your real goal is to produce the object itself, so it can be used for whatever. What he's saying is, activities that are ends in themselves, that aren't for producing independent works, are superior to activities that produce works. And this is interesting, because what is happiness? Happiness is an activity in accord with virtue. And what does that activity produce? Well, it produced nothing other than itself. You might say it doesn't produce virtue as a byproduct. It is a virtuous action or activity. Therefore, happiness is going to be an activity that's an end in itself, in that the activity is in fact the goal. It's not producing anything in addition to itself. Let's just step back a little bit here and think about this. Animals do not have to concern themselves with the nature of the good life or happiness because they function instinctively and they lack the reflection to even consider it. However, as human beings, in order to be happy, it's not sufficient just to have the impulse to want to be happy. Ultimately, it seems to necessarily require knowledge of what is actually good for a human being. And, it is the case that Aristotle has this general definition that probably, not everyone's going to agree with at the end of the day, and that this is, for him, the supreme form of human happiness. But implicit in what he's saying is a notion that obviously individuals have their own conception based on who they are and their nature, contrary to some of his claims. But the point even then would be that you have to have a sufficient knowledge of yourself and your own life to even achieve that. So here you can see that he's talking about issues of means and ends. Means and ends. And this science, ethical science, in a sense, is going to be the means to our own happiness. And he's trying to clarify its role, the role of this science in human life. And he says this: "Now, since there are many actions, arts, and sciences, the ends too are many. Of medicine, the end of health. Of shipbuilding, a ship. Of generalship, victory. Of household management, wealth." So what has he given us here? He's given us various arts and sciences. And an art is simply a kind of a craft. Normally it's manual labor, but not exclusively, in which there are a series of a set of instructions involved to how to produce the thing, and your goal, your objective is to produce the thing as a result of the art. And then there are sciences that have goals as well, right? So we see that this is not rocket science, but the point of medicine is not knowledge for its own sake, but it's to make people healthy. The point of shipbuilding is not simply to know how to build a ship, but to build a good ship that will be seafaring. The goal of generalship is not just to understand war, but to go and win it. Household management, that's actually economics, is the management and production of your wealth, right? He says, and in all things of this sort that fall upon under some capacity, just as bridle making and such other arts as concern equestrian gear fall under horsemanship, while this art and every action related to warfare fall under generalship, so in the same way some arts fall under one capacity, others under other, in all of them. The ends of the architectonic ones are more choice-worthy than those that fall under them, for these latter are pursued for the sake of the former, and it makes no difference at all whether the ends of the action are the activities themselves or something else apart from these, as in the sciences mentioned above. Okay, what is he saying here? What is he saying? Well, let's look here for a second. Here we're looking at two hierarchies of human goods, right? Let's start with the most recognizable one on the left here, right? What is the highest human good? It's happiness. It's the thing for which we do all else. It is the end. It is the highest good. You'll notice below that are a series of goods in our life that make up ultimately, if you had all of them, the totality of our existence. They are ends in themselves on one hand, but then you realize that they are all just means to happiness. They're the foundation. You think of, if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, they're the foundation to achieve happiness. And they all start to fit together in a fairly systematic and coordinated way. Of course, every chart would vary in the details from one person to the other. But if you look on the right, this is exactly what he's been talking about. There is a good and there is an art or science that pertains to that good. So if you look on the right, you have the arts and sciences that pertain to all the goods necessary to achieve happiness. And he says this, he speaks of the architectonic ends, which are more choice-worthy than those ends that are not architectonic. Architectonic, he means like the cornerstone. He means the most important foundation on which everything else is going to be subordinated to. The science of ethics is going to be an architectonic science, in that it is the superior science. Because, and why? Why is this? Because it's concerned directly, as opposed to indirectly, with your happiness. In a sense, a doctor who's trying to keep you healthy is concerned with your happiness, but in an indirect way, he provides one facet, or she, in regards to the health of your body, but it would be the health, you could say, of your soul that's going to really help you to achieve happiness. So therefore, if happiness is the ultimate goal or end, therefore the science of happiness would also be the architectonic science. Okay, he gets really funny here. He speaks of political science, he speaks of generalship, horsemanship, and bridle making in this passage, and you ask yourself, what is he talking about? Why, in this book about us, is he talking about generals fighting wars and horsemanship? Because you can start to see the way in which these things connect together. Okay, bridle making. He's literally talking about the thing that goes on the horse so you're able to control the horse, right? What's the goal of bridle making on the right? On the left, the goal, to make a good bridle that allows you to control the horse well. And a horseman or cavalryman need a good bridle to control the horse properly. So you have the art of horsemanship, right? Which is superior to bridle making, because bridle making is only for the point of the purpose or the sake of horsemanship. It's subordinate to it. What's the goal of horsemanship? Riding well, riding your horse well and performing your military actions appropriately, right? But the horseman knows how to ride the horse well. It's the general who knows what they should do with the horse. in terms of how to win the war, right? So therefore the art of generalship is not the art of riding horses, it's the art of winning wars by knowing how to employ the cavalry properly, so they achieve a victory rather than a defeat. But generals don't make the rules about when they should go to the war. Who makes the decision on when we should go to war? It's not the generals. You know what the generals do. The expression, the generals have a hammer and they always see a nail. Well, whenever there's a situation in the world, they know that the solution is to send in the military. It's the politicians who make the decisions about war, right? Because they're concerned with what? The happiness of the community. The general's just concerned with victory. He doesn't have time to bother himself with a full understanding of what would benefit or harm his community as such, right? So, I mean, this is an interesting discussion. You think about the scientists who made the atomic bomb. They were just technicians, right? Whatever their opinions about the use of that weapon were indifferent. The government itself was indifferent to them, because their job was to make the thing, and it was the politician's job to employ it when they decided it was appropriate. Raises an interesting question. Should, for example, scientists be in charge of science, making the ultimate moral decisions? Aristotle's model actually says no, that natural scientists or scientists dealing with genetic engineering are not the people who should be making the decisions. It should be the politicians. And why is that? Because they are expressing the opinion of the people at large and what they think they want. Okay, so let's move forward briefly, and we'll conclude by looking at chapter 2. If, therefore, there is some end of our actions that we wish for on account of itself, the rest being things we wish for on account of this end, and if we do not choose all things on account of something else, for in this way the process will go on infinitely, such that the longing involved is empty and pointless. Clearly, this would be the good that is best. Boy, what is he saying here? He says there's some goods that we choose because they get us other things. And then there's some goods that are the things we really, or even the thing we really want. Which one is best? The one we really want. It becomes self-evident. What are we searching for? What is he groping toward and explaining in different ways? He's talking about human happiness here. And with a view to our life, then, is not the knowledge of good of great weight, and would we not, like archers in possession of a target, better hit on what is needed? What is he really telling us? We're human beings. We all want to be happy. Wouldn't it be helpful to have knowledge of the human good, of happiness? And isn't he implicitly acknowledging that we're all ignorant of it? I mean, this is the problem of human happiness for Aristotle. The problem is that what we want is felt as an impulse, but the achievement of it is a result of moving from a state of ignorance to a state of understanding that does not happen on its own accord. It's only done through an active, and you might even say self-conscious effort. You have to have an awareness that this is what's going on, right? If this is so, then one must try to grasp, in outline at least, whatever it is of which of the sciences or capacities it belongs. What are we going to get here? We're going to get an outline of human happiness here and the relevant matters that pertain to it. But it might be held to belong to the most authoritative and most architectonic one. He's talking about, notice how he speaks. Why does he do this to us? He's talking about the most architectonic science. Why is ethics the architectonic science or politics? Because they're both concerned with human happiness, and human happiness is the architectonic good of human life. And such appears to be the political art, right? For it ordains what sciences there must be in cities and what kind each person in turn must learn and up to what point. And he's going to say that ethics, he doesn't even use the word for it here, but ethics is really a form of political science, happiness, but concerned to the individual rather than the collective. So notice that the politician ordains, he determines, he dictates, or she, what sciences and arts and sciences will be in the city, right? The scientists have, whatever kind of science it may be, have all this expertise, right? But it's the politician who determines which sciences will exist, because they're concerned with the well-being of the community, and they're looking at questions of right and wrong. The person performing the science is not looking at questions of right and wrong vis-a-vis the community. They're looking at questions of right or wrong only within the confines of their science. And certain sciences don't even dictate questions of good, right or wrong, right? And there's all kinds of types of inquiries and bodies of knowledge. When he talks about science, he's talking about a body of knowledge that might not even be appropriate in a certain community. We also see that even the most honored capacities, for example, generalship, household management, rhetoric, fall under the political art, because it makes use of the remaining sciences. So you notice that it's politics that makes use of these subordinate arts and sciences. So it is using them as an instrument to achieve its larger end of the happiness of the community. And further, because it legislates what one ought to do and what ought to abstain from. Its end would encompass those of the others, the ends of the other sciences, with the result that this would be the human good, right? It legislates what the other arts and sciences should do. So this is exactly the point. The politician is concerned with the well-being of the community. Therefore, he legislates and even dictates what the scientist who's producing the atomic bomb, the circumstances, how that knowledge and power is going to be used, rather than the scientist. It also says this, in another sense, that if politics legislates to the other sciences, and politics is concerned with human happiness, our own conception of our happiness legislates to all other aspects of our life how we should conduct ourselves. It's going to dictate to us and to all our other activities. And of course the problem is, who thinks in those terms? Nobody sits there and thinks through their whole life and all its hierarchical relationships. But I think this is exactly what he's asking us as individuals to do, to think of our life in those terms. For even if this is the same thing for an individual and a city, to secure and preserve the good of the city appears to be something greater and more complete. The good of the individual by himself is certainly desirable enough, but that of a nation and of cities is nobler and more divine. So it's really interesting here. He actually claims that the good of the collective or of the community is greater and superior, more divine than the good of the individual. Now, what's interesting is that it appears that way, right? He says it appears to be something greater. He doesn't say it is greater. If you're in Nazi Germany, which good is superior? Your own well-being or the good of a bad regime? Being a good citizen in a bad regime means being a bad human being. You see the problem there? How often do we really have a truly just community where the most noble thing one could do is to be a patriot and to engage in citizen virtue, right? So there's an interesting tension lurking here between the value of these two ends, individual and collective, a tension we've already seen in Plato. He says, the inquiry, that's this inquiry, then aims at these things, since it is a sort of political inquiry. What is these things? He's talking about the happiness of the individual. What is this thing that is sort of a political inquiry? Well, it's this book, the Ethics. It's a sort of political inquiry. It's